FTN DataCast, the fantasy football podcast where data drives the discussion. Here are your hosts, Adam Pfeifer and Tyler Loechner.
3 teams left here with the NFC West. Welcome back to the FTN DataCast presented by the FTN Network as we continue our team preview series. Had the NFC West start off earlier this week on Monday with the Rams, followed by San Francisco. And now we close it out with Arizona, followed by Seattle. Adam Pfeifer, Tyler Loechner with you as always. Tyler, we were just talking before we got on, talking about, the hot weather right now this summer. Yeah, and I don't think we should complain because in Arizona it's like 100 plus there's no humidity and everything without humidity. Like it's I'm hot right now. It's really warm, but I can't complain too much.
Dude, I've never been to Arizona. I don't know if I ever will, but yeah, I know it's like a death trap there.
Yeah, like I don't know if I am either, but if I do, I'm just going to fully be prepared to sweat the entire time. But yeah, again, if you are new to the podcast, if you just checking us out, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review, and go back and listen to some of the episodes, right? We just finished some positional previews that were really fun, really in-depth, and now we're going to be doing, probably one division for the next couple weeks, breaking down each team. And we continue with the NFC West, and that's with the Arizona Cardinals, who you look at the beginning of last season, Tyler, they looked like they didn't look like it. They were the best team, the hottest team in football. They started like 8-0, 8-1. Kyler looked like he was the MVP of the NFL, and then had that injury, I think it was Thursday night late against Green Bay, missed 3 games. And then even when he came back, Hopkins missed time, and Arizona really kind of fell apart in the second half. But let's start with Kyler Murray at quarterback. Where do you have him penciled in? What do you expect from him here? Because it was kind of a tale of 2 seasons last year, at least for fantasy, and I guess for real life too, for Kyler Murray.
Murray is a player that I was, 100% all about last year. I think most people in the fantasy community were. And like you said at the beginning of the year, it was like, I think he came out of the gate with 34 points back-to-back weeks or something like that. And we just felt like the smartest people alive. And then, he fell off the second half of the year, injury. When he did come back from the injury, he started running more. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit, which was encouraging. But bottom line is, he still is a rushing quarterback in a fast-paced offense, has good talent around him. I still have him ranked 6th. So I have Josh Allen, Herbert, Mahomes, Jackson, and then Hurts ahead of Murray. And I think I could go either way with like Hurts or Murray, flip-flop those two. So yeah, I think he's top 5, top 6 for me still. I mentioned though that he started running the ball more after he came back from injury last year. But on the whole, his rushing was way down last year, and his explosive rushing was also way down. So in 2020, Murray had 32 runs that went for at least 10 yards. Last year, he only had 14 runs that went for at least 10 yards. This is on the advanced rushing stats tool from FTN. And the arrival of James Conner also severely limited Murray's goal line rushing. He had 5 rush attempts from inside the 5 last year. He had 8 the previous year. He only had 3. He had 3 rushing touchdowns from inside the 5 last year versus 5 the previous year. So almost cut in half in terms of his goal line rushing work. So those are the concerns with Murray. Honestly, it's the only reason he's not like a slam dunk top 3 fantasy quarterback. What's kind of your take on him?
Yeah, he's in the same range for me. I have him 7 because I have Burrow like barely ahead of him. And I think we'll talk about it obviously, but if DeAndre Hopkins weren't suspended, I would have Kyler ahead of Burrow and probably even higher. But yeah, like you mentioned, he scored 34.6 and then 35 fantasy points his first 2 games, had a rushing touchdown in each of his first 3 games. And that was when, at the time, James Conner and Chase Edmonds were kind of splitting work. But once we saw James Conner take over as the lead back, and it coincided with Edmonds missing games, that's when we saw the rushing totals come down from Kyler Murray, and it was exactly what you talked about. James Conner was just so ridiculously efficient at converting touchdowns last season that it really hurt not only Kyler's rushing touchdown potential, but his passing touchdown potential. Like, I know he missed 3 games, but he only had 24 passing touchdowns. He had 1 or fewer passing touchdowns in 8 different games last year. And then you look at it, James Conner had 10 rushing touchdowns on 16 carries from inside the 5 last year. only Jonathan Taylor was better in that regard. Like, that's insanely efficient for Connor. He'll score touchdowns. He's going to be the unquestioned goal line back, but like, assuming he doesn't convert at that high of a rate again, that'll lead to more touchdowns from Kyler Murray. And I was really impressed by Kyler Murray. Looking at some of our advanced deep passing numbers. Murray had the second highest completion percentage on deep passes last season at 49.3%. And it's not like it was a Tua situation where it was kind of skewed by a lack of volume, right? 14.3% of his pass attempts traveled at least 20 yards down the field. That was the third highest mark in the NFL. So to see him do that, and you look at the personnel last year, Hopkins didn't make plays down the field when he was healthy. It was occasional AJ Green and Christian Kirk shots. So now we'll talk about this as well. You add Hollywood Brown, who's been a really good deep threat in the NFL, who has a rapport with Kyler Murray. I think he could be just as good in that department again this year. And he's going to run, right? Like, you look at even with the numbers coming down a bit, he still averaged over 6 carries, over 30 rushing yards per game, and 200 of his rushing yards came off designed runs. So that's going to be a part of their offense still. And the offense is incredible for fantasy, right? 36% no huddle rate. You can look at that at our FTN daily. If you look at our pace tool, 36% no huddle, easily the highest rate in the NFL. So the upside's insane. The question is, how much do we worry about the 6-game suspension from DeAndre Hopkins? Because the splits with and without Hopkins last year were not very kind to Kyler Murray. That's really what it comes down to. And that's why I have him 7 compared to, however high you might be on him, whether that's 3, 4, 5, what have you.
Yeah, I actually don't have the splits. Do you have the splits in front of you?
I can get them right now. I looked at it, I wrote up Kyler in the fantasy crossword series between him and Joe Burrow, and it was one of the closest ones I've done, but literally it just came down to the fact that he's going to be without Hopkins for 6 games.
Yeah, pull him up. I want to hear that. And while you do that, I'll also point out, you brought up his accuracy on deep balls. Murray was accurate. We show adjusted completion percentage on our advanced passing stats tool. He had the 3rd highest adjusted completion rate in the league. Joe Burrow led that stat, and then Jared Goff was actually second, but Jared Goff's yards per attempt was only at 6.5.
And if anybody's not aware of like the difference between traditional completion percentage and adjusted is basically just taking away throwaways, drops, spikes,
batted passes, right?
Yeah. So
we also take away passes where the quarterbacks hit as they're thrown. Or when they're throwing.
So Kyler, obviously, you look at it, 10 games with DeAndre Hopkins in the lineup, 278 passing yards, almost 2 passing touchdowns per game, 23 almost fantasy points per contest. In the 5 games without DeAndre Hopkins, 1 passing touchdown per game, 227.6 yards per game. So about a 50-yard drop in yardage and 15.5 fantasy points per game. So
that's dramatic.
It's bad. And I think a huge part of it was obviously, we can tie it in with Hopkins if we want. Hopkins last year was not a volume receiver. He was getting all the touchdowns. They didn't really have anybody they trusted in the red zone to throw the football to. So it's not surprising that his passing touchdowns went from 1.9 to 1. But then you have to, like, it's also interesting too, because it's not like the same situation where it's like, oh, that's what he did without Hopkins and he's going to do similar this year, because it's not like they're going in with AJ Green. And then obviously Christian Kirk's not there anymore, but it's not like it would have been AJ Green, Antoine Wesley and Rondale Moore. They added Marquise Brown, who we'll talk about. Let's go right into the receivers, because I think that's a really good talking point. And then we'll go to the backfield. I know you have talked a lot about Hollywood Brown on this podcast. Let's go to him first, and we can kind of talk about what we should expect from Hopkins and where we'd be comfortable drafting him, knowing he'll be out for 6 games. But Marquise Brown, clearly they traded a bunch to get him. And there's clearly a rapport with Kyler Murray, so it should be a pretty interesting fit. And I want to talk about the first 6 weeks. Like, Hollywood Brown's gonna be an every week must start player.
Yeah, for like season long rankings, I really am not 100% sure what to do. Or like best ball rankings, I'm not 100% sure where to put Marquise Brown. Right now, I have him 17th. But that is pretty heavily influenced by those first 6 weeks, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I think I have him 21, so a little bit lower, but like...
But I have no problem putting it at 21 either. Like that's kind of my point. Like, he's in this kind of floater range for me, but those first six weeks are going to be money, dude. He's going to be so good those weeks. You absolutely are correct. He's going to be a must-start player, and his target volume is probably going to be similar to what we saw in Baltimore for those first 6 weeks, where he was top 10 in the NFL in targets last year. That was a stat that we've talked about before. It surprised me. Honestly, my favorite Hollywood Brown thing was when it was like, I think it was the first night of the draft, and it was like, breaking news, Hollywood Brown is traded to the Cardinals. And then they like cut to him and he's already at their draft party. Like obviously, he already
I
knew
actually
about
didn't
it.
even see that.
It's so funny. And then Lamar Jackson tweets like, what? But clearly Marquise Brown already knew. Yeah, you have to watch that. It's so funny. Anyway, yeah, Brown, he's a good fit, and he's a good fit with the offense. You mentioned that last year, the only player that was really making the plays downfield was old man AJ Green, who ended up being better than everyone was expecting. But Marquise Brown, one of the premier deep threats in the NFL at wide receiver. I think he's going to match up really well with Kyler Murray. I honestly wish I knew. I wish I had a better analysis here. I don't know what the offense's target tree is going to look like once DeAndre Hopkins is back, because Hopkins, it seems like a player that will never command less than 25% market share. So what does that bump Hollywood Brown to?
I don't know, because here's my problem with Hopkins in this offense. I don't think Cliff Kingsbury's like the greatest play caller. Like, I think he got the extension, which is great. Like, he's a fine coach, but like his play calling and his schemes are kind of weird, because they have not, in the 2 years DeAndre Hopkins has been on the Cardinals, they have not moved him around the formation. He literally goes like the left side of the field like 70% of the time. Hardly plays in the slot. Doesn't move around, which is really strange, especially when at the time, it was him and then nobody else really, right? That's frustrating in itself. So if they're not going to move him around again, and Marquise Brown primarily has played outside in his career, 2 wide sets, it's obviously going to be Hopkins when he's back and Hollywood Brown. 3 wide sets, which the Cardinals have run 3 wide as much as any team in football, right there with the Buffalo Bills over the last couple seasons. When they're in 3 wide sets, which they will be a lot, who's that third receiver? Is it AJ Green? Is it Rondale Moore? Is it Antoine Wesley? Because
they liked Wesley near the goal line, dude.
Wesley was really good last year.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about it when we get to Rondale Moore and Wesley and AJ Green. They're pretty much in the category of like late best ball stacks if you had Kyler on your team for me. But I think Hollywood Brown is a perfect player that you can feel like, again, he's a top 24 receiver at worst every week for the first 6 weeks of the season. I'm interested to see if they move him around the formation or they just play him on the perimeter and let him win deep routes, because again, Kyler's deep ball numbers were great last season. That was with AJ Green and Christian Kirk, and Hollywood Brown's much better than both of those players, especially deep down the field. Real quick, is he a player you would consider like right around week 4 or 5 if he's doing well, just saying, all right, time to sell high?
Yeah, I would 100%. Because
even if you might know, obviously, that Hopkins is coming back, but you can easily try. It's not going to be bad with Hopkins back.
Even if you have concerns with Hopkins, yeah, he's not going to be bad. But even if you have concerns with Hopkins, his arrival's not, it's not going to be good for Hollywood Brown. Mm-hmm. And you interested me. I just looked up our receiver field directions tool. And you're right. DeAndre Hopkins was very heavily only on the left side of the field. About 70% of his receptions and yardage came on balls thrown to the left. And actually 50% were completions that are considered short left, which I believe is less than 10 yards down the field. So
yeah, Hopkins, every number
not
outside
the usage you would really expect.
Exactly. Every number outside of red zone usage for Hopkins was bad last year. His 6.1 targets per game, I believe, were a career low. He averaged like 9.1 or almost 10 the 4 or 5 years prior to last season. So he was, for the first time, and it sounds crazy to say, DeAndre Hopkins was touchdown dependent. And now they have Hollywood Brown. Like, for me, like, Hopkins is right outside my top 40 receivers. Like, I'm probably not drafting him. It's just like, it's not, because it's also not like that range of receivers where he goes. He still goes in like the 7th round or so. It's not like you're missing talented, high upside breakout candidate receivers in that range. That's right where, a lot of the receivers I like go. So will he be would I project him to lead the team in targets from week 7 on? Probably, but I don't know if it's the discrepancy we've grown accustomed to seeing for DeAndre Hopkins compared to his target share from everybody else on his team.
So this is, you've got me looking at the breakdown of where they are on the field. Marquise
this is why
Brown,
we do the podcast.
I love it. Marquise Brown, deep right. He had 630 air yards deep right, which was the second most among all wide receivers in that portion of the field. Jamar Chase had almost 900, which is nuts. But Marquise Brown only had 139. He only converted 139 of those. He was actually really, really, really inefficient last year. But what's interesting is
Detroit Lions game.
Marquise Brown's arrival looks like it might hurt AJ Green the most.
Yeah, I was going to ask, where's AJ Green there?
AJ Green had the second most receiving yards in the NFL on the deep right, behind Jamar Chase. It was Jamar Chase, AJ Green, Justin Jefferson. So yeah, I mean, AJ Green seems like the player that will lose out on those deep balls, assuming Hollywood Brown gets them, and I don't know why he wouldn't. Or maybe they just start like a completely vertical offense. Like, does that?
I mean,
like,
Kyler doesn't throw to the middle of the field a lot, so it's entirely possible.
It is entirely possible. Which, if that's true, then we should probably like Kyler a little bit more. I mean, if they're just going to be vertical all the time, it's a really good reason to like him. And I also think some people might not like Murray as much right now because everyone loves James Conner and everyone's worried about James Conner and rushing so much. But you already mentioned it. He's probably not going to score touchdowns at the same clip. So it's not like it's not like Kyler or these wide receivers really are cheap. I mean, we're talking about Marquise Brown in like the 15 to 20 range. So these aren't necessarily sleepers, but definitely an offense worth targeting in fantasy. It's just hard to pinpoint. I do think AJ Green is kind of like a wild card here. Like, what is his role? And then you've talked about it. What is the role of DeAndre Hopkins? Is he still elite once he comes back?
The role for Rondale Moore is also interesting too, because when he was drafted by the Cardinals, like Dynasty, Twitter and everything, they loved him. Super excited. I totally get it. But the usage for him last year was just ugly, right? He had minus 0.1 yards before the catch per reception last year. Minus. It's like running back type stuff. His ADOT was barely over 1. He, like, the majority of his targets came off screen passes. There was no vertical downfield usage at all in his game. And he only played 37% of the snaps in a season where Hopkins missed as many games as he did. Now you have AJ Green back, which I don't think we expect. We knew Christian Kirk was probably going to be gone, but we also expected AJ Green to be gone too, but he's back.
We did.
Hollywood Brown's there. Hopkins will play after week 7 or week 6 or whatever. So Rondale Moore is a player that I went from before the Hollywood Brown trade. I thought he was a really interesting post-type sleeper. Now he's literally only on my radar as a late stacking option if you have Kyler Murray in best ball drafts. I just don't like the usage from him, and maybe it's just not going to be, maybe that's what we're going to see from him at the NFL level because of his size. Coming out of college, like his final season at Purdue, he was scheme touches everywhere across the field because there was nobody else in that offense. And I think Rondale Moore can win down the field. He did it at Purdue. It's just when you have AJ Green there and Marquise Brown there, and even Antoine Wesley, who like you said, was used down the field and in the red zone, and then obviously Hopkins when he's back. You're not going to ask Rondale Moore to do that in your offense. If you sort
in our air yards tool, which is free, by racer, which is really just you take the player's total receiving yards and divide it by their air yards, Rondale Moore like completely breaks the scale. He had 435 actual receiving yards, but only 97 air yards.
I thought you were going to say 9, and I wouldn't have been surprised.
Yeah, his average off the target, you mentioned it, 1.49.
That's like...
It's just hard to, score fantasy points when you're basically like a running back. I mean...
Also,
and you don't get that much volume.
Like I said, 37% of snaps last year. Maybe the first 6 weeks, he's like 45, 50. But again, like, he's not a lock to play over AJ Green.
No, I don't think he is. I don't think he is. I mean, AJ Green was better than people were expecting last year. And I don't think you take him off the field for Rondale Moore unless you're just like really dead set on those little screen passes. Maybe Cliff is, but
the Cardinals do run a lot of screens. Like, Kyler was 4th in screen attempts last year despite missing 3 games. Hopkins played a huge part of that because he just was on the left side of the formation all the time. So like that is part of their offense, but like again, Rondell's got to be in the field to get those screens, and can he occasionally take a screen to the house? Sure, but it's tough to make an argument for him.
I don't think he really changes that much from last year. I think we kind of just see basically the exact same role. He had a 15% target share. Christian Kirk left, and he had 19 deep ball targets, which was the fourth most among all wide receivers in the NFL. But then they add Marquise Brown. He's probably just going to pick all those up. So like it just doesn't change Moore's role.
All right, let's go to tight end, where Zach Ertz was traded about midway through the season to Arizona. Was serviceable, but then once DeAndre Hopkins went down, that's when Ertz became just it was the same as Philadelphia, right? Like nothing after the catch the ball, fall down, 6 yards here, 8 yards there, 12 here. He had one long touchdown, it was like 50 yards against Houston on like a broken coverage. But you look at his numbers last season with Hopkins out of the lineup, really, really good. I think it's got from week 8 or week 6 or so is when he was traded to the team.
I have the splits. I got the splits.
Yeah, go for it.
So with Hopkins and without Hopkins, I have the numbers backwards right now. Let me flip this on the FTN splits tool. You can like customize it all. All right. So without Hopkins on the field, his numbers are not crazy here, but he averaged 2.5 extra targets per game, which is significant. 1.5 extra receptions, yards and touchdowns were basically the exact same, but he scored 20% more fantasy points, basically 11 points per game versus 8.5 points per game.
Well, here's the other thing though. If you sort it from when because that takes into account his games with Philadelphia too.
That does take into account his games with Philly.
If you don't sort it from, I believe it's like week 6 was when he joined the team. I'll pull it up.
I'm doing it right now.
That's when it gets even better.
You're right. His targets almost double. All right, so I have it from week 6 on. His targets almost double up to 8. I'm just going to read his splits without Hopkins.
Do week 7 real quick, because I lied. Week 7 was his first game with Arizona.
Okay, so I have Ertz with and without DeAndre Hopkins in the lineup here. So this is from week 7 onwards. Without DeAndre Hopkins, his targets almost doubled. He went from 4.5 to 8.5 targets per game. Receptions went from 3 to 6. Receiving yards went from 40 to 55. Touchdowns stayed the same, but his fantasy points increased by 50%. In PPR leagues, he went from 8.5 fantasy points to nearly 13 fantasy points per game. So, yeah, he's not a world beater with those numbers, but definitely a weekly fantasy starter in PPR leagues.
Yeah, he's like he's my favorite tight end. Like after, like if he's my last tight end in the top 10 where I'm like, okay, I feel good about him. And then if I miss out on him, that's when I go to the breakout candidates at the position, Cole Kmet, Irv Smith,
I think we talked about that in the tight end position breakdown.
And like I prefer him over Knox, Freiermuth, Gesicki.
Maybe not Gronk. I mean,
Gronk, definitely Gronk over him if he's back. And then like I have Goddard ranked higher than him just because I think there's a higher ceiling, but I prefer waiting the 3-4 rounds to get Zach Ertz. Mm-hmm. So I'm perfectly fine with him. Not a massive ceiling, but the floor should be solid. And again, the splits are notable because Hopkins will miss the first 6 weeks or first 6 games of the season. Let's close out with the backfield. Unless you have anything else to add.
I was going to say, he was a target monster. I mean, that late in the draft, he goes right around the 10th round, 11th round. He had the 3rd most targets among all tight ends. So only behind Kelsey and Andrews. So yeah, a great floor.
James Conner won a lot of fantasy leagues last season. Look, it was a great story. To see him come back and just smash. I mean, 15 rushing touchdowns, 3 through the air, 18 total scores. We talk about it. The goal line work. Only Jonathan Taylor had more carries inside the 5. The touchdowns, it was insane. What do you expect this season? Because we also saw the splits when Chase Edmonds was out of the lineup. James Conner's receiving numbers and receiving fantasy points and everything like that skyrocketed, and it became it was just like, okay, this is a cheat code because he's an every down running back getting goal line work and a fast paced, good offense. It's, Edmonds is gone, but the team did recently bring in Keontae Ingram in the draft, But recently, Darrell Williams, who's been a very capable pass catcher during his time in Kansas City. So we haven't really talked about that. Does that do anything to you for James Conner? And what do you expect from him overall after last season's debut in Arizona?
So that would concern me. It does concern me like a little bit for Conner because I do think Williams is a legitimately good player. But Conner's still really cheap. He's only the RB15 in underdog ADP right now, and you can get him like in the middle of the third round. And for a player that was just like a locked in top 5 fantasy running back last year without Edmonds, I have the Edmonds splits, of course, in front of me. You mentioned it. Really, the big thing that changed was that receiving work. Without Edmonds, he averaged 5 receptions, 44 receiving yards, and he averaged 23 PPR points per game, up from 13 when Edmonds was in the lineup. So just like that's a huge amount of production for a player that's going as the RB15 right now. So I actually really like Conner at cost. I think he's a top 10 fantasy running back. I don't think I'm going to rank him there, but I think that if he doesn't get hurt and plays this season without, in that 3-down role, I just don't see there's no scenario where that doesn't produce a top 10 position. Williams is the wild card though, as is Kyler Murray running the ball a little bit more. Cause I think I mentioned earlier from weeks 12 or 13 onwards, Murray did start running the ball more. That actually might've been because Edmonds, I think that was around the time Edmonds was missing some time too. But the bottom line is, I think Conner's a little bit too cheap in drafts right now. What's your take on him?
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with him. My problem is where he go, like, I just love to take the receivers in that range, right? Like, that's kind of where like T. Higgins goes, Keenan Allen, who you wrote about today, actually.
Yeah.
So check that article out. What was it? It was the most consistent players, correct?
Most consistent wide receivers.
Yeah. So Keenan Allen, I mean, was Mike Evans in the article? He had to have been, right?
He wasn't in the top 10.
Yeah. I guess it's more so just like he gets at least 1,000 every year, right? We know that, but like sometimes he scores 15 touchdowns. Sometimes he scores
I did
8.
most consistent just last year.
Gotcha.
So I did just last year. Yeah, I think if I looked back over the last 5 years, it would shock me if Evans wasn't there.
So the only thing about Conner that I'm not really worried about, that I'm just wondering, is if he's the unquestioned third down pass catching running back, 2-minute drills, all that great stuff.
Right.
Because he wasn't last year until Chase Edmonds was hurt, and all they had behind was Benjamin, who I actually loved as a deep sleeper before the draft and everything. But now they add Keontae Ingram, and they also just added Darrell Williams. Darrell Williams becomes like, we talked about Darrell Henderson on the Rams episode, like not quite to that level, but like I think he's the backup running back here. And again, I don't think the Cardinals offense this year will be as good as the Chiefs offense has been since Darrell Williams has been relevant there. But we've seen Darrell Williams be not just like a capable flex starting running back in fantasy, but like a borderline top 12 player at running back. Again, not to say it'll be the same level, but like I think he would be the guy because Benjamin doesn't have a lot of experience, and Keontae Ingram is a rookie. So, but for Conner, that's the only thing I'm worried about. Like, is he the unquestioned pass catching running back? Because if he is, like, there aren't many running backs that have his resume, right? Like, there aren't many running backs that are getting all the goal line work in a fast paced, high scoring offense and getting the third down and pass catching work. I mean,
right.
that's Christian McCaffrey has all that, but it's not the greatest offense. Eckler is the one where it's like, okay, he got everything last season, especially after the uptick in goal line and usage and stuff like that. Najee is an every down back. Joe Mixon kind of, for the most part, sometimes is inconsistent with the passing game. Fournette, who goes in the same range. There's another running back that goes in the same range, and I think you can make every case is the same for this running back, except the offense isn't as good. And that's Saquon Barkley. Barkley or Conner? Because I have an ADP article coming out tomorrow, and Barkley went from like mid third round pick, and everybody was like, oh, imagine Barkley in the third round. And now he's going at the turn. Like he's going like 24th overall.
Yeah, he is going at the turn. I love Barkley.
Barkley for me is FOMO. I'm terrified to not have interest in Saquon Barkley when he's finally healthy again, especially in a new offense with Brian Daboll. And the Giants actually, I believe, looking at the pace stats, were second in no huddle percentage, so they went pretty fast too. maybe the only thing Jason Garrett did somewhat okay with their offense last year. But yeah, like Connor's in the range for me. He's right in that same range, right? Alvin Kamara, Connor, Barkley, Chubb, Aaron Jones. Jones and Connor I struggle with. I have them 12 and 13 respectively. How would you rank those running backs I mentioned? Kamara, Connor, Barkley, Chubb, Jones. Let's do half PPR because if it was full, Chubb would probably be last, right?
I would do the Kamara versus Barkley is tough for me. I'd probably rank Kamara ahead of him, but I probably, like in a best ball setting, I probably draft Barkley ahead. So maybe I just need to switch those rankings. And then I would do Aaron Jones in a half PPR. It's a little bit closer because I do think Jones is going to catch a lot of balls this year. And then Connor. So Connor's fourth for me out of that grouping, but he's not like far behind.
Yeah. I'm dangerously close to moving Barkley in my top 12. I'm really getting excited. The other thing I wanted to mention with Connor is like, as long as the volume doesn't go away, which I don't expect it to, that's fine and it won't matter. But he was not efficient last year. Like he was like he was like one of the least efficient running backs to see the type of workload he did in all football last season. So the only reason I bring that up is if for whatever reason, like say his goal line work comes down a bit and Darrell Williams plays a little bit, because like before the Edmonds injury, they were both playing. They're both getting like 12 to 15 touches a game. And if they want to give Darrell Williams somewhat of the Chase Edmonds role, that would hurt James Conner. But as of right now, I'm not overly concerned. We also have to keep in mind and remember, they gave him an extension in the offseason. Like, what was it, like 3 years? They gave him a decent amount of money too. So I expect him to at least be like 18 to 20 touches a game with obvious upside for more. Any closing thoughts on James Conner and what are your thoughts on Darrell Williams? Is he the clear backup here, and where does he kind of slide in among? We talk about these backup running backs where they rank in drafts. He's obviously not in the Pollard, Jones, Madison, Ramondre Stevenson, Darrell Henderson range, but I would probably put him in like the Dameon Pierce range, maybe even ahead of that.
I think Williams is interesting. Remember last year, the big concern with Connor was that he's injury prone, and it's just like a player is injury prone until they're not.
Deebo Samuel.
I think you actually might have said that in the 49ers pod.
It's literally like, I literally said that like every recap article I did of Deebo Samuel is literally, that was the line. Like it's just, it's so true though. Like Keenan Allen was like that too. Remember Keenan Allen?
Yeah.
Fluke injuries and he gets listed as injury prone, and then he doesn't have fluke injuries and he's been
Christian McCaffrey, dude.
Receivers.
Christian McCaffrey, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my take.
You got to work it in every episode. Huh? That should be the
try.
goal. How many times?
Should be the goal. Dude, it's so easy to do. We just talk about good fantasy players.
Right.
Darrell Williams is a player I right now his ADP is like RB50. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's like RB50. And I think like Kenneth Gainwell, Darrell Henderson, Michael Carter, like you're talking about some of these backups. I would draft Darrell Henderson over him. We talked about him on the Rams podcast. I think Henderson is a top 15 fantasy running back locked in if anything happens to Cam Akers. And I think he also has standalone value. I don't know if Williams will have standalone value. It wouldn't surprise me if he does, but I do think it's a roll of the dice. Like I could definitely see Connor in the 3-down role. He had it in Pittsburgh. He had it last year when Edmonds was out. The question is if Connor does get hurt, does Williams become a great 0 RB candidate? Probably.
Yeah.
Like, Benjamin just doesn't, they've really never given him much work, even in settings where it would make sense to give him a lot of work. So yeah, I like Williams as a 0 RB candidate or like a late round flyer. If you are still a believer that James Conner is injury prone, which newsflash, that doesn't exist. Just people play football and get hurt sometimes.
I was going to say, it's called playing, especially, but it's called playing the running back position.
And playing running back. So yeah, Williams is a good target. I think of I've got the ADPs in front of me now. Of the players going in his range, Kenneth Gainwell, Michael Carter, Nyheim Hines, Khalil Herbert. The only one that I would definitely draft ahead of him is Darrell Henderson.
Yeah, totally fine with that. Let's close it out with this last question. Over or under, let's say, 13 total touchdowns from Connor, rushing and receiving. 13. Again, he had 18 last year, which nobody expects to be repeated, but 13.
I'll say under, just because
I was leaning under as well.
13 is still a high line, but I would definitely say over 10. I think he's a lock for double-digit touchdowns.
All right, Cardinals, very interesting. We'll see how they do in the first 6 games without DeAndre Hopkins. We'll see how Kyler Murray and Hollywood Brown do together at the NFL level, and we'll see if they can, get back to being a legitimate candidate in NFC. I think people are just kind of expecting them to not be a threat to the Rams, but they still have plenty of talent in the team, especially on offense. So we will see. We will close it out on Thursday with a look at the Seattle Seahawks closing out the NFC West before we move on to the rest of the divisions in the NFL, breaking down every team from a fantasy perspective. Thanks for listening. As always, for Tyler, I am Adam. We'll talk to you guys on Thursday. Peace out.
Thanks for listening to the FTN DataCast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And follow the hosts on Twitter at Pfeifer24 and at Loechner NFL.